A very good afternoon, Ms. Karima Al-Khoury, UN Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, Her Excellency Anne Basara, Ambassador of Finland to Malaysia, Dr. Julita Onavanjo, Representative for Malaysia, United Nations Population Fund and Country Director for Thailand, esteemed panelists, honourable members of Parliament, representatives of government, excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the UN country team, members of the media, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shani Manli and it's an absolute honor to return once more as your MC for our International Women's Day Forum 2025. Now I hope it's not too late for me to wish all the ladies in the house a happy International Women's Day, and for our audience as a whole, that you spent the day acknowledging the important role women and girls play in all our lives. And that's exactly why we're here today, isn't it? To recognize the need for rights, equality, and empowerment for all women and girls in Malaysia. So how about we kick off our session here today with some appreciation for our women and girls, shall we? Yes! Now, ladies and gentlemen, Our forum today is brought to you by the United Nations in Malaysia in collaboration with the United Nations Population Fund and the Embassy of Finland. Thank you, partners. To consider the global theme for this year's International Women's Day, for all women and girls, in the context of Malaysia and the region we exist in. And yes, that's a lot to consider. But first, let me start by sharing something I read on LinkedIn just last week. A highly respected woman in her field, breaking barriers in an industry once dominated by men, lamented, "I hate International Women's Day. I hate the idea of a day dedicated to telling women they can be better if they do more." This hit me hard, but more importantly, it really got me thinking. How well have we addressed the structural barriers that prevent women from doing better? Every year we meet for IWD to discuss all the things we need to do to meet our 2030 SDG 5 deadline. And now with just 5 years to go, to what extent have we bridged these inequality gaps so that women from all walks of life can thrive like everyone else? This year, 2025, is a pivotal milestone in the fight for gender equality and women's empowerment, as it marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, a landmark commitment to advancing women's rights globally. And yet, progress in the most basic of areas has been uneven, and new challenges, from climate justice to digital tech, continue to emerge. So today is not just another conversation, ladies and gentlemen. It's a call to action. In our forum today, we'll hear from experts and advocates who are working on the front lines of research, technology, business, leadership, economics, and the elimination of gender-based violence. We'll explore the barriers that still persist, from unpaid care work to the gender wage gap, from tech-facilitated gender-based violence to the lack of gender disaggregated data. But most importantly, we'll also discuss solutions that will drive real, tangible progress. I hope you're ready, ladies and gentlemen, because it's time to turn our discussion into commitment. So, to officially get the ball rolling, how about we hear first from our venue host, whom we can kindly thank for this lovely auditorium we're in here today. For his welcoming remarks, let's turn our attention to the screen for a video message from Dr. Sanjay Sarma, CEO, President and Dean of the Asia School of Business.
Hi there. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I wanted to reflect a little bit on the field of artificial intelligence and the impact of the diversity of human beings on AI. It's important to note that if you look at the history of artificial intelligence, there are many people that don't get credit, but probably deserve enormous recognition for their foresight in creating what is modern artificial intelligence.
One of the people who, in my view, was the pioneers in predicting modern artificial intelligence was an extraordinary person by the name of Ada Lovelace. In fact, computer scientists have a language called Ada, named after her. And Ada Lovelace was the niece of Charles Babbage, considered the father of computer science, and she predicted AI. Another person who had an incredible impact was Fei Li, the Stanford computer scientist, who created something called ImageNet, on which all the competitions that showed that AI was working and could achieve certain milestones, they were all created by, came from ImageNet, for which Fei Li gets extraordinary credit and should. But the other thing I want to say is that I know that diversity, equity, inclusion, access, these are not fashionable terms anymore. But ironically, the least human of our achievements, artificial intelligence, which is by definition a robot, actually cares deeply about diversity. The reason is artificial intelligence mines for knowledge and information from all perspectives and weaves together a mathematical construct, which is called the embedded space, from which we generate predictions and generative images and sentences and words and paragraphs. And just as a table that is big and wide is more stable than a table that is narrow, similarly, AI actually seeks out diversity and breadth And so in a strange way, we have a reversal at a time when humanity seems to be rejecting diversity and a breadth of experience. AI actually seeks it out. And I actually believe that on this day, at this moment in time, these very letters D, I, E, A, etc., which coincidentally spell idea, are perhaps fundamental to the future of AI. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there, and I wish you all the best at this event.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjay. I'm sure the next time you open your ChatGPT or DeepSeek, think a little bit about Ada Lovelace, who predicted AI in the 1800s. Next, ladies and gentlemen, no IWD is complete without a specially recorded video message from the Secretary General of the United Nations himself. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Antonio Guterres.
The doors of equal opportunity are open for women and girls. Everyone wins. Equal societies are more prosperous and peaceful and the foundation of sustainable development. On this International Women's Day, we recognize 30 years of progress and achievement since the landmark United Nations Conference in Beijing. This transformed the rights of women and reaffirmed those rights as human rights. Since then, women and girls have shattered barriers, defied stereotypes, and demanded their rightful place. But we must be clear-eyed about the challenge. From pushback to rollback, women's human rights are under attack. Age-old horrors, violence, discrimination, and economic inequality still plague societies. And newest threats, such as biased algorithms and programming inequalities into online spaces, opening up new arenas of harassment and abuse. Instead of mainstreaming equal rights, we are seeing the mainstreaming of misogyny. We must fight these outrages and keep working to level the playing field for women and girls. We need action to unlock finance so countries can invest in equality and to prioritize those investments. Action to open up equal opportunities for decent work, close the gender pay gap, and tackle challenges around care work. Action to strengthen and implement laws to end all forms of violence against women and girls. Action to secure women's full participation in decision-making, including in peace building. And action to remove the obstacles to women and girls in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The United Nations Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact offer blueprints to guide these actions. When women and girls can rise, we all thrive. Together, let's stand firm in making rights, equality, and empowerment a reality for all women and girls, for everyone, everywhere.
Thank you so much, Mr. Guterres. When women and girls thrive, we all rise. I really, really love that. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome on stage for her opening remarks our UN Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam, Ms. Karima El-Khoury.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, and I'm really sorry that we made you take part in this event on crutches, but you did assure us you were not in pain, so thank you again. Distinguished guests, excellencies, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, quote, "If we want to build the nation we want, we need to empower women." These are not my words, but the opening sentence of the Honorable Prime Minister's speech at the International Women's Day event this past Saturday. A few colleagues were with me there. The statement was the foundation upon which Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim built a compelling and powerful argument on the central role of women in Malaysia and what remains to be done. It filled me with hope to listen to the Prime Minister celebrating women as mothers, educators, bearers of the values of humanity, care, and solidarity, but equally as agents of growth and development, as champions of integrity, and leaders in science and technology, with an immense potential to influence how fast and how far Malaysia will go. He also commended the many ongoing efforts and initiatives led by the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development, and sent a loud and clear call to all his cabinet members to make women's empowerment their business as well. I would like to take a moment to congratulate YB Khazanah Shukri, who is not able to be with us today, Minister of Women, Family and Community Development, on the launch of the new National Women's Policy Action Plan, a policy that we hope will permeate all other national policies and strategies and serve to both mainstream gender equality and women's empowerment and make it a national cause and driving force behind every woman and girl in Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the UN in Malaysia as we mark the International Women's Day today. Our appreciation goes to governments, civil society organizations, representative of businesses, to all our partners in the diplomatic community. Special thanks go to the Asia School of Business for hosting our event for the second year in a row. And I also want to extend my warm thanks to the Embassy of Finland in Malaysia. Thanks, Your Excellency and Vasara, for the great idea to celebrate women from Asia and the Pacific through the art of photography. Welcome to Mr. Rauli Virtanen, an artist and renowned explorer of this part of the world. Thank you for sharing with us how you pictured and how you saw women from your lens. I encourage you all to spend a few moments viewing the exhibition outside. The fight for gender equality is far from over. This year's theme for all women and girls, rights, equality, empowerment, underscores both the urgency and the universality of our mission. The month of March is for celebration. But we cannot celebrate progress without recognizing the setbacks. 30 years after the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the most ambitious blueprint for gender equality, we are witnessing a rollback of women's rights in many parts of the world. From regressive policies to cultural narrative that seeks to reverse hard-won gains. The Beijing Plus 30 review tells us that while gains have been made, they remain fragile. The world is still failing women and girls. Progress is too slow, gaps persist, and in some areas, we are even regressing. 1 country in 4 from those that have reported progress at Beijing Plus 30 are saying that they are experiencing rollbacks. That's 25% of the world. A woman or girl is killed every 10 minutes by a partner or member of her own family. So by the time I finish my speech, we probably have lost another life to that. So the fight is far from over, as I said, and this year is both pivotal and one of the most challenging for women and girls. In a few hours only, the Commission on the Status of Women will convene its 69th session. CSW was established in 1946 and has played a pivotal role in shaping global norms, from drafting key parts of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to leading the adoption of the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, in 1979. CSW has been the driving force behind the 1995 Beijing Platform of Action. This year, CSW is convening at a time when the very fundamentals of gender equality are being challenged, when hard-won rights are at risk, when the space for women's voices is shrinking, and when the principles of equality and non-discrimination are being put into question. But CSW will continue to do what CSW does very well. Remind the world that we must not only defend past gains, but push forward with renewed determination. CSW, a vital space for collective action, for reaffirming commitments, for driving the transformative change that the Beijing Platform for Action envisioned 30 years ago, and for building a future where the rights, dignity, agency of our women and girls are non-negotiable. Ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia has actively engaged in global fora and global frameworks, such as CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action. They have provided essential guidance for national policies, for shaping legal and institutional reforms to enhance women's rights. These global commitments must continue to inform national efforts to close gender gaps and ensure inclusive development, which addresses the widening economic inequalities, stagnant labor force participation, and the prevalence of violence against women and girls. Conflict, climate change, and economic crises disproportionately impact women and girls, deepening vulnerabilities and threatening hard-won development gains. But international best practices and intra-regional collaboration through ASEAN and beyond show us hope and possibilities, and they are truly endless. We have an opportunity and moral obligation to turn commitments into action. We've spoken enough. It's time for action. It's time for change. The Secretary Generals, whom we've just heard, just issued a report on Beijing at 30, outlining the 6 priority areas he mentioned, those actions and action areas that must shape our collective response. They are both useful as a global framework, but also a catalyst for action and change at the national level. It is now our moment to move from promises to progress by 1, investing in women's economic empowerment, 2, strengthening laws and institutions and legislative frameworks, 3, expanding education and skills development and beyond just attainment to excellence and to areas that women have not explored enough. 4, ensuring universal access to healthcare, including sexual and reproductive rights. 5, ending violence in all its forms against women and girls. And 6, amplifying women's voices and leadership. These are not abstract ambitions. These are concrete, evidence-based, and urgent actions that can drive systematic change. This is how we can accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. This is how we can make the promise of Beijing a lived reality for all, and how we can ensure that every woman and girl, regardless of their background, of their identity, of their circumstance, have the right to a life of dignity, equality, and empowerment. There's great news, and the great news is I was looking at the very, headlines of the national policy of Malaysia, and it's precisely echoing these 6 areas. So Malaysia will be working and walking that path towards those 6, but of course, other areas as Malaysia needs to adjust also to its national realities. I want to underline also that women empowerment is not a zero-sum game. And rather, we all benefit, women and men, when women's myriad contributions are enabled and maximized. Society is stronger, it's more cohesive, the economy grows faster, it is more equitable, and our politics and governance are more inclusive and representatives. And these are not just words, we have seen proof. We have seen how women in power make a difference. Government, civil society, academic institutions, businesses, the media, and individuals, regardless of their gender, their age, their migratory status, their disability situation, their ethnicity, all have a role to play to amplify this call to action and to ensure that the momentum of Beijing Plus 30 translates into meaningful, irreversible progress. We must be fearless, we must be tireless, and we must stand together. Because when we advance the rights of women and girls, we advance societies and uphold the very essence of our shared humanity. So thank you very much for being with us today, and I look forward to a great panel discussion and to contributions from all of you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ms. Al-Khoury, for your speech. Hopeful, but sobering words indeed, and I hope in that context we can consider how much more crucial it is for us to act now for all women and girls. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached the highlight of our program today, the forum. Please just give me a moment to get up on stage. All right, I made it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic today for this forum, from policy to progress, turnkey solutions for inclusive national and regional development. Quite a mouthful, but certainly a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to set the stage by saying gender equality is not just an aspiration, a fancy phrase we use to make ourselves feel and look progressive. It is quite simply the very foundation for any nation's inclusive, sustainable progress, exactly like Ms. Al-Khoury said in her speech earlier. As we've heard from Karima earlier, despite decades of commitments, in Malaysia, gaps remain in policy, governance, and economic equity, and these are continuing to hold women and girls back. In this session, I'll be inviting up shortly my 5 fantastic guests to explore real, actionable solutions, from gender-responsive policies and data-driven governance to economic inclusion and the fight against gender-based violence, which, as you said, is a very important and urgent fight indeed, Ms. Al-Khoury. Now, as we approach Beijing 30 and the 2030 SDGs, how do we move from policy promises to tangible, lasting progress for all women and girls in Malaysia and beyond? For that, I'm pleased to invite on stage to join me our panelists, starting first with Ms. Amanda Kong Hui Zen, Community Development Manager of the Make It Right movement. Accompanying her, we have the very lovely Dr. Lai Swet Yen, Senior Lecturer at University of Malaysia's Gender Studies Program. All right, next up, let's invite Ms. Amelia Sharif, CEO of the Malaysia Institute of Development for Professionals, MIDP, and a Managing Partner at Speak Up Malaysia. We also have Dr. Jay Dessen, co-founder of Boom Grow. And Ms. Shakira Tay Sharifuddin, Senior Economist, World Bank Group in Malaysia. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we were also supposed to have with us Yang Berhormat Puan Sherlina Abdul Rashid, Member of Parliament for Bukit Bendera, Penang. She was meant to have joined us today, but regretfully we learned that her relative passed away this morning. So on behalf of the organizers, we extend our heartfelt condolences to YB and her family. And we will do our best to carry on with our panel forum without her, yes? So, welcome ladies. We'll first go around to each panelist and share some quick introductions. Now, Amanda, on my left, was diagnosed with congenital glaucoma at birth, resulting in visual impairment. But rather than let this hinder her, she now champions the rights of persons with disabilities in Malaysia. And, fun fact, Amanda is the first blind woman to qualify as an advocate and solicitor of the High Court of Malaya, and speaks frequently on topics surrounding disability rights. Welcome, Amanda. Now, Dr. Lai, apart from her work at as a senior lecturer, she also serves as coordinator for the Master of Gender Studies program. She has played a key role in shaping gender policies, from co-drafting Malaysia's anti-sexual harassment bill to advising on gender equity in higher education across Southeast Asia. Currently, she serves as a tribunal member for anti-sexual harassment under the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development. Welcome, Dr. Lai. Next up, we have Amelia, a prominent gender rights advocate and is part of the team which drafted the sexual harassment bill in Malaysia. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the G-Blog, Malaysia's one and only gender publication platform, while also serving as a member of Malaysia's Anti-Sexual Harassment Tribunal. Next up, we have Dr. J, whose company Boom Grow is a tech-driven farming company which was recently inducted into Forbes Asia 100 to Watch.
With over 18 years in ESG advisory and a PhD in sustainability standards from Queen Mary University of London, Dr. J is redefining food security and transparency, as well as leading the way as a woman founder in agritech. And last but certainly not the least, Shakira serves at the World Bank's Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub in Kuala Lumpur. She leads the Malaysian Economic Monitor, shaping key policy insights and advising the government on economic strategy. With a master's from Columbia University and a PhD in progress at UCL, she brings to our panel deep expertise in sustainable and inclusive development. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, I have quite a panel with me today. I'm very excited to start this discussion with all of you. Now, before we begin, I'm just going to quickly share an overview of what I'd like to cover with all of you this afternoon. First, let's look into the concept of gender mainstreaming and what that means for policy and governance. Then we'll dive into economic and workplace barriers that continue to exist for women. We can't discuss gender equality without going into gender-based violence and the legal protections we need to end it. Then I'd like to get your views on the role of inclusivity and intersectionality and the role it plays in policy making. And finally, before we cap things off, a look into technology, entrepreneurship, and of course, the future. Now, no doubt these terms and concepts are all very familiar to you ladies in your work on gender, but for the benefit of our audience, not to worry, we'll make sure we break down these concepts for you as best we can. So, ladies, I'd also like to invite you to chime in if anything else resonates with you from what our other panelists have to share today. All right, first, let's set the stage here with a question first to Dr. Lai. I think you might, all of you, agree that gender mainstreaming in governance is a critical step towards equality. But Dr. Lai, for the benefit of our audience, can you first explain what gender mainstreaming means in the context of policymaking and how well or not Malaysia is doing with this approach?
Thank you so much for the question. When we talk about the notion of gender mainstreaming, it means that we actually apply a gender lens. When we say we apply a gender lens, it means that we look at it from the, from the impact in terms of its impact on women and men, a certain policy, right? So yeah, and when we look at it, we don't look at it at just at a single stage. We look at it from the from the design stage, the implementation stage, and also in terms of monitoring. So say, for example, if you have a development program, you would, right from the outset, even from the budgeting and everything, you have to consider what is its impact on women and men. Even at the planning stage, who are we including? Are we just having men, or are we just having women? And of course, it depends on the program. And is there also, here we also talk about inclusivity and diversity. Are the various different groups represented? Say, for example, if you're working on something, to do with the differently able, are they being included as well? Yeah, so it's in terms of applying a gender lens to look at the impact of any program, and it could be any action. It could be a program, it could be a policy, it could be a legislation. And to the second part of the question, to what extent, right, in Malaysia we have applied that? I think to a certain extent there is. If you look at the recent, law that comes in, laws or amendment of laws that comes into being the last 2 years, you have in 2023, the criminalization of stalking, right, which is very much welcome, especially when we talk about gender-based violence, right, so that women does not have to, live in fear of being stalked and not being able to do anything about it. And of course, the Anti-Sexual Harassment Act, that was in 2022. So when we look at that, yes, in terms of protection, there is. But of course, also, if you study in detail, they could be, the laws also, there could be certain improvement. But more importantly, I think more glaringly, we actually don't have a Gender Equality Act yet. I think that's most glaring because we say our ultimate goal is gender equality. But what if we are being discriminated against? Of course, the Federal Constitution of Malaysia, I think Article 8.2 says that, it prohibits discrimination based on gender. But, like it or not, it becomes a toothless tiger when you don't have an overarching legal framework to protect women, to provide redress.
And quite frankly speaking, we see even around us in our day-to-day, some people don't even realize that their actions are actually discriminatory to women because it hasn't even been outlined formally for them, right? Yeah. So a gender lens. And that means that literally everything that we do in our everyday lives, we go look for our gender lens, put that on, and then we look at the problem or the program or the policy that we're talking about, yes? All right, so that brings me to Shakira. Okay, obviously I would love to have asked YB Sherlina about putting on a gender lens in terms of parliamentary reforms. But since she's not here, let's jump into macroeconomic and just basic economic policies. Often viewed as gender neutral, which we know is far from the truth. And if we're going to put on our gender lens, what happens when these policies fail to be gender responsive?
Thanks, Shani. So maybe I can start. I think one of the most familiar term in economics to many of us, and that is GDP growth. And then that's one area possibly where it's a main indicator of economic performance. And yet, if you look at the way it's been calculated, it fails to account unpaid labor, housework, childcare, elder care work. And obviously, these are disproportionately done or conducted by women. And this essentially it sends the message that whatever actions that women do on this front is less valuable. That's one. And yet, I think there's been a research before that shows that if we do actually bring in unpaid care work into the calculation of economic growth, it could create somewhere close to 400 million ringgit to the economy. So that's how much value it carries. And the fact that it's not recognized, it's basically a dismissal of women's role in the economy in general. And then I think secondly, in terms of economic policies as well, is when you talk about the labor market. A lot of the discussions in economic policies focuses on employment, particularly formal employment. That's where people think economic agents, human beings, play a role. But thing is, the reality is most women are either outside of the labor market or informally employed. And so again, it disregards the contribution of women to the economy as well. And the thing is, when the women are overrepresented in part-time jobs, in informal jobs, and when there's no or lack of attention in this area, that means in terms of protection, in terms of protection from being exploited, there's less of a discussion on this end. And I think maybe I'll stop here for a while and we can come back later to this discussion. If you look and think again about the discussion surrounding economic growth, a lot of the times it's very much biased towards sectors or industries where there's a large representation of men, and that is, there's a lot of talk about tech, about manufacturing, about construction, and there's little, or at least less emphasis or less discussion around sectors like education, care work, social work, even healthcare, and these are the sectors where there are more women employed as well. And I think it speaks volumes when you look at, for example, government's development budget, and you look at the distribution. So a heavy emphasis, I think 40 to 50% of development spending, at least in Malaysia, and I'm sure in other countries as well, 40 to 50% of development budget goes to economic sectors, and these are manufacturing, transportation, whatnot, and only 20 to 30% goes into sectors where there are more women employed. So these are, I guess, some of the examples where when you apply a completely neutral, gender neutral approach into policy making and how it impacts women at the end of the day. I do understand, as someone who has been dabbling or being involved a lot in macroeconomic policies, the idea in the beginning of being neutral is supposed to project an image of fairness. But I think in the midst of doing that, we forget that, we're not equal in many ways. We are all unique individuals, and we shouldn't be viewed as a monolith. So I'll stop here.
Can I just very quickly touch on, since you raised the development budget just now, 2025 budget for Malaysia was roundly criticized for not being gender sensitive enough. So say, for example, we put our gender lens on and relook formulating future budgets. How could that be done better?
I think on top of my head, immediately, I think there should be a bigger allocation and bigger thinking on care economy. I sometimes feel a little bit hesitant to use the term economy with care, because I think at the end of the day, care is basic right. it shouldn't be viewed as something to be commoditized or and then to make profit of. But putting in economic term, I guess, brings a lot more attention to it. And I guess to answer your question, Shani, that would be the first priority. I think that's where a lot of the attention and money and funding should be, I guess, channeled towards.
Totally agree. Yes, Dr. Lai. Yes, absolutely. I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, because if we look at some countries, like right in the Philippines, they have the Magna Carta for Women. And under the Magna Carta for Women, which is actually a local translation of CEDAW, right, Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, of all forms of violence against women. So there, actually, they allocate a certain percentage of their budget, 5%, for all the gender development programs, So it's very clear-cut, right? 5% at least of their budget. So I think here it's like we have a certain allocation for budget for certain items. But then on the other hand, I think for the 2025, I'm most disappointed to see that there's not much being allocated on gender-based violence. Right? If you look at the number of social workers we have in Malaysia, it actually falls far short of what we have. If you look at the number of population, even in Singapore, our nearest neighbor, don't mention in US and other countries, right? So I think we definitely need more social workers. Or actually, I think 2 days ago, UNFPA actually did, I think it was based on a study that UNFPA did, the portraits of survivors who went through the One-Stop Crisis Center. We know that One-Stop Crisis Center is a very pioneering initiative in Malaysia. It provides coordinated care, linking different agencies. It could be, when you go to the One-Stop Crisis Center, which is based in hospital, besides getting treatment, you can lodge a police report. You can actually also have psychological support and social welfare support. So it's like everything is put into one place. But on the other hand, based on the study that was done, it's found that, there's still lack of gender sensitivity when they assess those services. So where's the allocation to train, law enforcement or those who provide such services to them? And not just that, what about in rural areas? Do we have one-stop crisis center in rural areas? In Sabah, in Sarawak, or is it just mainly in the big towns where all the general hospitals are located? So I think that's a definite need, in terms of providing budget for that, because we know gender equality will not ever be achieved as long as gender-based violence persists.
Exactly, and I think for those who are in tech in particular, the term UI, UX. And I suppose gender mainstreaming is very crucial here, because if you're looking at UI, UX and you apply a gender mainstreaming approach to just about every consumer journey, every user journey, then you're going to start looking at things very, very differently, whether it's from budget development, whether it's from the development of a one-stop crisis center, to even the journey for a person with disabilities. So that's going to bring me now to Amanda, because your perspective here is crucial. Do you feel that government policies have successfully included women with disabilities in nation building, or are there still major gaps?
Thank you for the question. Now, when we talk about disability, the law that we currently have is the Persons with Disability Act 2008, which was enforced back in 2010. And it was enforced in line because Malaysia actually ratified the UN CRPD, or the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Now, with all due respect, when we talk about policy, when we talk about the law basically is just a theoretical thing. Policies is just theoretical thing. We have to place emphasis on implementation. And I must say, over the years, the Malaysian government has made some effort to implement laws with regards to persons with disabilities, but still there's a lot more need to be done. I'm speaking in terms of persons with disability in general, and this, of course, includes women with disability. When we talk about the law in Malaysia, for example, now the persons with disability law is basically drafted for the sake of Malaysia obligating to ratifying the CRPD. Why am I saying this? Because it is the provisions in the Act is drafted on a welfare basis rather than the social model of disability. When we talk about the welfare model of disability, basically is what can you do to make the lives of persons with disability easier? That is a welfare model. When we talk about the social model of disability, is basically how do you empower a person with disability to reach his or her potential based on the accommodations that are afforded to them. Now, a simple example would be the Persons with Disability Act basically mentioned that persons with disability should be given reasonable accommodations as others. But there's no definition of reasonable accommodation. The definition is very ambiguous. So a lot of people are unclear of what reasonable accommodation actually mean. Well, why go so far actually? I would say that majority of the persons with disabilities in Malaysia do not understand their rights because they are not educated and they are not aware on what their rights essentially are. So when someone does not understand their rights, you talk about empowerment, you talk about how do you want to make persons with disability included. They do not know that because they do not know that they have a right to do so and so. Like, for example, I have a right of access to education because there is no education that will enable them to better understand their rights. And I would say that going back to your question, how far has Malaysia gone? The government has made some efforts, like, for example, they implemented the zero reject policy to ensure inclusive education for all. And also they implemented the 1% of the public workforce should be persons with disability. But this policy still needs a lot of work and implementation because it has not reached the targeted number. And also, when we talk about zero reject policy, like I mentioned earlier, inclusive education is there. But you can see there's still a lot of children with disability who are left behind. And when we talk about women with disability, the challenges faced by women with disability is more than those faced by men with disability because we have to consider issue like gender sensitivity, we have to consider issue like intersectionality, where, for example, if you are a woman with disability, it's much more difficult for you to obtain assistance. Speaking from my own experience as a blind individual, it's very difficult for me to obtain assistance, especially from people who are from people in general, or the male population, so to say, because they tend to think of, if I provide support to you, will there be issue of harassment? Will there be issue of sensitivity? Can I assist you? How do I assist you? People generally do not know about these things. Yeah.
So you're dealing with a double stigma, which makes it equally
Yes.
difficult. You're dealing with the access that you're needing as a disabled person, but also the access that you need as a woman. And I suppose, Dr. Lai, when it comes to the Gender Equality Act, perhaps looking at the Persons with Disabilities Act first might be a good way to sort of consider how to move forward with developing this act later on. Now, Amelia, speaking about reasonable accommodations, Malaysia has introduced several legal protections for women in recent years. But how have these changes actually empowered women in both social and professional spaces by giving them those reasonable accommodations that Amanda spoke about? And for context, if you can also share what the situation was like before and why that change was necessary.
Thank you for the question. To begin with, I want to make a clear distinction between rights and empowerment. Because sometimes there is a law that says something. For example, in our federal constitution, there's big promises in terms of what our rights are. But whether or not we are given the platform to practice these rights are a completely different thing. And then there is also an issue of empowerment, whether or not on the ground you are empowered to practice this right, to opt in and to opt out accordingly, right? And to make this distinction between then and now, I want to share a bit of my personal journey. When I was growing up, we grew up in a very humble household. I was raised by a single mother. She was almost illiterate, and she was married very young. Hashtag say no to child marriage. And when sort of like her marriage fell apart, and naturally she would need to find a job to sustain our families, right? I have 3 other siblings. And at this point, sure, the law says she is able to go out and find work, but whether she is actually able to secure an employment is a completely different story. So for me, that's the difference between rights and empowerment. And I live my whole life on government subsidies and protection and all sorts of like welfare and social best assistance. And it has not been easy because, for example, the federal government would announce something that, say, as a household with a single income, single mother, we would be able to get certain kind of assistance, let's say XYZ, right? And I grew up in Penang. So from federal to wait for things to happen where I live, it doesn't happen quickly, right? So we have to wait until the state government sort of like have their infrastructure together and all of that. And then we will go and apply, and then we wait, and you know, then that takes ages and ages. And my mother took on a job, a blue-collar job in a factory to raise us. She was paid like 400 ringgit per month. And with this income is basically what we have to sustain on a day-to-day basis. As a result, she has 3 other jobs. And I've worked when I was as young as 7 years old, right? So then people would ask this question, you know, but that's child labor. You shouldn't have, you know, have to do that, right? Which is completely wrong. But whether or not, when we make policies, whether it transcends and whether or not it translates into the daily lives of people, that is a completely different story altogether. I think we have to remember that law and policies are made with very good intentions, but these intentions are also based on a balance of interests of all the people involved. For example, when we were drafting the Anti-Sexual Harassment Act, sure, we want to protect women, we want to protect basically every victim of harassment, but at the same time, it's us versus capitalist lobbies and like all sorts of lobby that's, you know, and at the end of the day, the government being the government, they have to balance the rights of all of these parties involved. So I would say the translation is usually where the value is lost when it comes to policy. And then and now, I must say there has been big changes when it comes to what you know, the government did back then versus now. It is always a continuous fight, but even basic infrastructure in terms of law and policies are not there. Dr. Lai mentioned Gender Equality Act. If I want to pile on to that, we could talk about Equal Pay Act. We could talk about Wage Transparency Act. We could talk about, you know, at least certain kind of code of corporate governance when it comes to the way that all of these things are reported by corporations, right? So I would say that remains a gap up until today, and women are more empowered, and you know, we speak up a bit more, but we always forget that perhaps the target audience might not even be those of us that are in this room today. Because my mother would not have been one of the people in this room today, and we would remain to be one of those people that fell through the cracks. So something definitely has to be done about that.
And also the awareness of that, the awareness of those rights that they have. Absolutely. Now, Dr. J, I know we're not supposed to be asking you a question until much later, but I want to touch on this specifically because you're an entrepreneur. And being an entrepreneur as a woman, as we all know, is quite a different journey than it is for a man. So there are, of course, lots of encouragement from the government for women to get into entrepreneurship, into tech, into STEM. But on the ground, like what Amelia was saying, are those allowances translating to the people they're supposed to benefit? What's your experience been on this?
Thank you. First of all, what an inspiring panel. You know, I've already learned so much in terms of really broad macroeconomic policy and gaps in actual policy that makes impact. I, as an entrepreneur, I'm very much on the ground. I bear a lot of war wounds of building a business, 2 businesses from scratch. So my story tends to be very much, what is it to be on the ground and, you know, sort of reimagine an industry. To give you perspective, agri-tech, not just in Malaysia, globally is a male-dominated industry. We can count the number of women who work in technology broadly. And I'm actually truly, I want to, you know, lean on what you said in terms of rights and empowerment. For a woman to start, you know, any woman-led business, you know that there are policies, there are agencies in place where we can go and avail ourselves to systems, resources, and whatnot. But whether she is empowered enough, number one, to know where to go, to ask the right questions. And even if you do, number two, a lot of times, all businesses are treated as one homogeneous whole. When businesses are so different. There are very small, small stores to, fast-moving startups to even within startups, there are scale-ups that are going on different private equity. So the needs and wants of businesses tend to be very different, whether it's women-led or men-led. So just from that perspective, I think government policy needs to factor that. Apart from the fact that different industries have different requirements, but in picking up on that empowerment thing, my feedback is a lot of women tend to shy away sometimes from industries that perhaps they feel they may not know, or it's something different. And for me, that's, and especially in tech, right? Because there's so much push for tech. And I'll just talk about the perspective of tech because that's where I come from. But hey, I don't have a background in STEM. My background is in humanities. So what really helped me to get there in terms of sort of leapfrogging into the technology wave is this ability to really ask those right questions, be absolutely curious, and be relentless in knocking on doors, right? And that agility in thinking, that whole feedback in terms of AI. AI is, well, it's going to take away a lot of jobs, but it definitely is going to change the way we do business and how we run the world as well. So being empowered enough as a woman to really embrace fields, because at the end of the day, I sit in front of panels of investors all the time. Number one, they are all men. It's not just in Malaysia, even globally, 2 to 3% of venture capital investment goes to women, and that's extremely low. Right, that needs to change. So we need more men sitting on both sides and more women sitting on both sides. Yeah, but women shy away from these industries. Women don't go into finance as much. Women don't go into tech, into healthcare. These are all massive trillion-dollar industries. Agri-tech is a $60 billion industry, and the kind of things that we're doing. I'll just finish with the fact that why diversity is so important in this industry is the fact that when you're rethinking an industry, the playbook is open for you, right? And we are bringing biologists, we are bringing data scientists, engineers to build this company to soar. And that is so exciting. And that diversity of skill sets is also very gender neutral. It's open for everyone. So definitely rights, what is available from you from policy, that needs to be really rethought from a actual actionable perspective, but also empowerment to action on it for women businesses.
Fantastic. Now, listening to all of your perspectives on this, I want to circle back to Dr. Lai and putting on that gender mainstreaming approach or that gender lens. The Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development introduced something called gender focal points into ministries. This has been an interesting approach from the government to try and apply a gender lens to everything. And as Dr. J was saying, you go to agencies, you go to all of these places to try and get help. And honestly, it's hard enough for a person to do it. It's even harder for a woman to even find where to get that specific help. So how successful do you think gender focal points are currently? And how can they, if implemented properly, strengthen the impact of gender mainstreaming?
I'm sorry to say I don't have an answer to that, because to have an answer to that, it needs to be evidence-based. And as we all know, the gender focal point has only been implemented for around 2 years, right? So in order to see how effective it is, a study needs to be done. But I would say that I've actually come across a study that says that, there are those who doesn't, at the operational side, there are those who do not understand what gender mainstreaming means. So if that's the case, I think there's actually something is wrong somewhere, right? If you have gender focal point and you have people who don't understand what gender mainstreaming means, then, the effectiveness and whatnot is more like by accident gender, not by design. But here we are talking about by design, right? Yeah. When we want it as a policy approach. Yeah. Right? So I think it's very important, even for laws and for any policy program, the monitoring part, I think that's where it's missing. I think we need to have that so that we know how effective it is.
So you're saying we need to sort of go back to basics, take a few
Yes.
steps back and do the baby steps first. Yeah. And your experience in your gender sensitive, I mean, you've done research on gender sensitive policy making. You have not actually looked into the gender focal points quite yet.
Because it's, you know, it just,
Too
it was,
early.
I think it started late 2022. So now it's early 2025. So it's just, you know, 2 years. Yeah, so I think really we need to study and see how effective it is, to see whether there's any, you know, loopholes or whatnot. Say, for example, we want to have, we want to have gender mainstreaming. Is there enough budget being provided? Because you can have lots of program, but what if there's no budget, right? Then it's not going to fly anyway, just like not enough social workers, right? Not enough one-stop crisis center for rural women. You know, just to kind of illustrate a few examples.
So a good basic first step would be first for organizations and ministries to allocate a budget first for gender mainstreaming to take place. Then only you might start seeing some success in having gender focal points present.
Yes, enough budget, and of course, you know, in terms of the monitoring, you need to monitor to see whether it's being implemented properly, right? Because we know in Malaysia or in many other countries as well, everything looks good on paper, right? Excellent. But when you scrutinize in terms of the implementation, that's where it falls apart. So I think here the lesson is still the same. We need to see how it's being implemented, you know, in order to understand whether the gender lens is being applied, right? Yeah.
I have another question for you, Dr. Lai. We know that, of course, data plays a key role in driving gender equality and, of course, in shaping those policies in the first place. But I understand that in Malaysia, we lack gender disaggregated data, or GDD. Now, for the benefit of our audience, could you first explain what GDD is and how not having it affects policy decisions and advocacy efforts for gender equality?
Okay, gender disaggregated data is when you collect data, you actually have the sex, right? You know, say for example, you don't just say the number of students in a class, but the number of female students versus the number of male students, right? So in general, that's very basic. But of course, if you look at in other contexts, other than female, male, you could also add transgender, right? Yeah, because also in terms of stats, they have found that in some countries, let's, for example, talk about gender-based violence, right? We know that when it comes to gender-based violence, it affects women more than men. But do you know that in some countries, when they look at it, they find that it affects transgender more than women as well? So in that sense, there's also lots of information, lots of data that we lost in the process if we don't account for that. And when we don't have gender disaggregated data, we cannot actually plan properly, right? I think just to take an example, right? I'm sure, in terms of the Global Gender Gap Index, right? So the Global Gender Gap Index measures the achievement of women versus men in 4 main areas. But let me take the example of economic participation and opportunity, because we have actually talked about that quite a bit also. If you look at the data, if you look at the year 2023, right, and the year 2024, you find that Malaysia ranking has actually slipped, you know. Overall, Malaysia ranking for the Global Gender Gap Index, overall, education, health, economy, and also political, right, in the political aspect. We have actually fallen by 12 places. And yeah, that's right. And it is mainly because in the economic and the political segment, because we are doing well in terms of education, and also we are doing well in terms of health, right, relatively well. So we fell 12 places, right, from 102 to 03 in 2023 to 114 in 2024, right? If you look at those data, and if you look at the data for economic participation and opportunity, you find that the percentage of women in the economic sector is only at 55 or so %, compared to men, 80%, right? And if you compare to some countries, at least they have 69%, and other countries 80%, but Malaysia just 55. But if you look at education, right, we kind of look, oh, we are doing very well in education, because if you look at the higher education institution, you find that there are more women. But on the other hand, do you know that stereotyping, because I think, there's less women in tech and whatnot, right? It was raised. I think one of the things that we need to change is also the way how we raise our children. And I think the curriculum also need to address this, at the very, even at the primary level itself, right? Yeah, because why, during my time when I went to school, I have to choose. It's only mainly home science, where you learn cooking, sewing. I cannot choose carpentry even if I wanted to, because I'm female, and that's how they have streamed it, right? So that's where gender stereotyping starts, yeah? So, yeah, sorry, we were... yeah.
So basically, the importance of data before anyone is even considering making policies.
Yes,
it's crucial.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to that, to continue on that, because when we look at educational attainment, the stereotyping one, and secondly, when we look at the data also, because when you look at the data, it says that there's less women in engineering, or even in tech, as shared earlier on. But so in a sense, we are saying, oh wow, it's great, there's lots of women in higher education, but that doesn't translate to their economic participation, because the data shows that. So it's like, so during that transition period, what happens? Why are women not joining the economic sector? So, yeah, so...
Yes, please, Dr. J.
The pain of building a tech business.
Yes, the data tells a very different story. Yeah?
It does, but a lot of times, for a woman to succeed and to have that imagination and ability to even transcend and get into a new industry is really because they can't see advocates or examples or other women who have done that. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of mentorship. While budgets are fundamental and important, but I would say and I'm not talking about just women mentoring, we need men to mentor as well. I've been mentored by both amazing women and amazing men to have achieved and that I would say would be key for our young women to really open their minds in terms of because in terms of skill sets, abilities, capabilities, it's all there. We've built that. But in translating that and looking at that from a practical perspective, because today, if you want to build a business, it's not just competitive ability, it's scale. You want to show empathy. You need to show so much more ability to build bridges, and that really is the secret sauce to building amazing businesses. And if you really dig deep, that's what women do so well. But the investment and the funding is not reaching women-owned businesses, and that is the deep challenge that we have today.
Yeah, certainly a lot to think about, especially when we now know that that data isn't being collected, and so therefore, when policies and budgets are being drafted, we don't actually know if the money is going to the right place to even help the people that this is supposed to help. Now, we'll come back to that in just a little bit, but I do want to touch on a question with Amanda, especially since we are looking at policies. Now, Amanda, you were instrumental in redrafting the Persons with Disabilities Act 2008, and you curated the first ever report on the status of PWDs in Malaysia. Now, when it comes to legislation and policies, where do you think Malaysia still lags behind in meeting its commitments to the Beijing Declaration and also to CEDAW?
I think the first thing that we need to look at in understanding how do we commit to a certain policy is how well does it work with the community here. So the first thing that they need to do is basically understanding the landscape, the community landscape of persons with disabilities here. Because when you're talking about Beijing Declaration, it's accessibility to healthcare, education, increased participation. But before all that can happen, it's essential to understand what the community actually needs. A simple example would be if you want to provide accessible education to a person with disability in Malaysia. So you have to provide accessible educational resources. Or if you want to provide accessible employment for a person with disability, how can you make your workplace inclusive so that you are able to reasonably accommodate the needs of a person with disability? So before when we talk about commitment, it must be awareness and sensitization, where people need to be more aware of what the community of persons with disability need. And when you are aware of the needs, it will be easier for you to draft the laws and policies that will enable you to meet the needs of persons with disability. Now, when you talk about legislation, when I was in the Bar Council Human Rights Committee, and it's interesting because we touched on Article 8.2 of the Federal Constitution. Now, Article 8.2 basically states that it's equality for all persons, regardless of gender, race, descent, and place of birth. But guess what is missing? Disability. It's not included in the Federal Constitution. How are we supposed to draft policies that relate to persons with disability when the law that governs Malaysia, the highest law, the Constitution, does not even provide for persons with disability? So that's why I mentioned earlier, going back to what I said earlier, laws and policies are really there as a theory. It's important to focus on how well it has been implemented. And we talk about data just now. It's interesting that you mentioned data, because when I was curating the status report for persons with disability, the most difficult thing to do is actually collecting data. Because number one, they do not have that data, or the data is obsolete and outdated. The second one is that people are reluctant to give the data, because what is interesting is that the Persons with Disability Act does not actually require mandatory registrations of persons with disabilities. Now, why are people reluctant to register as a person with disability in Malaysia? Because of the stigma. Whenever you register as a person with disability, you will be put in a box. People will label you as a person with disability. Well, simple example, simple daily example. Whenever you go out and you see a person with a child, when you see a parent with a child with disability, what is the first thing that Malaysians or our society usually do? Stare. And people tend to be not comfortable, so they tend to keep their children at home and not expose them to society. And it's because of this stigma, a lot of people are reluctant to register to get the disability card, which actually provided various benefits, which was not highlighted to them. And because most of them are concerned of how are they being stigmatized. If I have a disability card, it's very difficult for me to get employment, because a lot of persons, when they put their disability on their resume or CVs, the first thing that employers will do is, okay, I just put their CV aside. I don't want to hire that person with disability, because a lot of corporations tend to focus on the cost factor due to their lack of awareness. Cost factor basically means that they would think that if I employ a person with disability in my workforce, I would have to incur more cost, because a person with disability needs a lot of support. I would need to provide a lot of reasonable accommodations. But these are the assumptions that people have. And this actually stems from the lack of awareness. And going back to your question, when you talk about how far along has policies and laws been successfully implemented, I would say that we are still a long way there. Because the first step, in order for people to fully understand how to implement these policies, the awareness level needs to be there. And how do you be aware is you have to understand the community landscape and understand the different needs of all persons with disability based on their categories.
And we come back to data.
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Lai.
Yeah, I just want to follow up and add on a bit to what Amanda had shared, because we were talking about gender disaggregated data just now. So that's also another aspect that's missing to the gender disaggregated data, that we don't collect intersectional data, which means when we collect data based on gender, female, male, or transgender, if you add that, what about those who are disabled, right? Because we have multiple social identities, you know. We could be differently able. What about those based on age? What about those based on ethnicity? For example, when we talk about the labor participation rate, average is 55%. But if we were really to scrutinize it, you know, is there any difference between urban and rural, between those who are differently abled, between the indigenous people, or, you know, and a Chinese person, or a Malay or an Indian person? So I think we actually need data, they are more refined, that also capture those aspects, so that we know if we wanted to, to kind of empower, right, those who are differently able, what are their needs? Yeah? So, yeah.
So, going into the next part of our discussion, we've already got this context that we've laid here, the importance of gender mainstreaming, having a gender lens to everything we do, the collection of data, first to get the amount of information we need so that we can support those needs, and then only we talk about policy making and budgeting. So we have to now circle back all the way to the beginning and just start with that gender lens. So it's a very interesting way to start our panel. But now I'd like to go into discussing specifically on the economic and workplace barriers for women. Shakira, you did mention this earlier in your answer, but I'd like to go a little deeper into what you were saying. Now, we know women in Malaysia continue to face significant barriers economically, the gender wage gap, unpaid care work, limited access to finance. What policies do you think are the most urgent in closing this gender gap?
Sure. Maybe I could go back a little bit to the points that were raised by Dr. Lai and Amanda as well. We talk about there's a gap between the participation, women's participation in the economy here in Malaysia, where if you look at female labor force participation for women, I think it stands at around 56% versus men, I think, who are about 80+%. And so the government has a target, basically, to push it to 60%. But here's where where data plays a big, illuminates things. So if you, I guess, scrutinize it a little bit further, if you look at the women's participation rate in places like Kuala Lumpur, Putrajaya, Selangor, it supersedes 60%. It's almost 70-80%, similar to what you would see in some other more developed, very developed countries. But if you go and if you look into places like Kelantan, the northern states, for example, the participation of women in the economy is much, much lower. I think even below 50% in terms of labor participation. So that's, I think, an example where, how data is important, and when data is there, the need to scrutinize data and look deeper into the data beyond just aggregated numbers. And so we look at your question on, I guess, gender gap and pay gap, for example. I think this is an opportunity for me to, I guess, share as well that the wage gap that we see between men and women in the labor market, sometimes there is a misconception that it is a cause of why women don't participate. But in reality, I think it's more of a reflection of outcomes. So if you look at the labor market landscape in Malaysia, most women, at least in the formal labor market, are between the age of 20 to 29. And these women are employed in administrative positions or entry-level positions. And many women exit the workforce once they reach a certain age. Usually when they start having families, they leave and they never return. So what's left is men who are able to climb, I guess, the career ladder or progress in their career. So these men go on to occupy higher rank roles, more senior roles, which are obviously command better salaries. And that's one reason why the wage gap exists. Second point is women, again, as I mentioned earlier, are employed in lower paying sectors. So we are employed in teaching, care work, versus men who are more predominant in sectors like tech, finance, which obviously pays a lot more. And obviously, I think there are small things like, for example, wage discrimination at point of entry. So there are occasions where women are offered lower pay for the same job as men. So I think what this highlights is that the role of care work in being a challenge for many women to participate more effectively in the economy. And I think there's been lots of literature out there that talks about how we can sort of address that. And I think one of the things that I guess COVID or the pandemic has illuminated to us is the idea of flexible work. And I think we have to take a step back and expand our thinking about flexible working and not just limited to jobs that are 9-to-5 desk jobs. When we just, I guess, acknowledged earlier that women are employed in sectors like social work, healthcare, teaching, and these are sectors where you can't necessarily, channel people and put them work remotely. So we need to think more carefully on how we should approach flexible work for women and also for men as well. And I think in a lot of our discourse about care work, we tend to focus on women. But I think if we make the policies and measures more inclusive, then you would have fathers who could take or can play a bigger role in care work, sons who can play a bigger role in care work as well. And I think one critical aspect of care is obviously childcare. And a lot of, I think there's been a lot of literature and discussions out there about how we should make childcare accessible. And for me personally, I would take one step further. I think affordable and quality childcare should not be exclusive to just working women. It should be made available to all.
The entirety of this sector that's not like construction, that's not tech, that's not manufacturing, for example, then it brings down what is the average salary that you can get within that sector, right? So that brings down your ability to contribute economically and to participate economically in your day-to-day. And when you see these kind of policies being made on the second point, which is there's a lot of initiatives to try and increase women's labor force participation, but the way that it's implemented, in my experience, sometimes raises a bit of question. So for example, flexible working is a huge thing. Every single one of my clients talks about flexible working, every single one of them. But when it comes to the way this flexible working is implemented, I'll give you an example. We have companies that provide flexible working only for women. And they're like, that's great, right? Because we're trying to, make sure that women can juggle their jobs at home and, as well as in the office. But what we don't realize is the more we make this kind of policies or initiatives, what you're doing is you're overburdening women so that in this household conversation between a husband and a wife, the conversation will sound like this: but you can get flexible hours, right? I can't because I'm a man, and therefore you will be more in charge of the day-to-day at home, and you'll be in charge of picking our daughters up from tuition or whatever, and I don't have those things at my workplace as a man, and therefore I contribute less in the household. So this is a very simple example to me that illustrates the way corporate organizations and entities, the way these policies is implemented. There's a lot of, I wouldn't even say it's tokenistic measures, because in my experience working with corporates, they have these nice big intentions to help, but perhaps without the government paving the way in terms of what's right, how do you attach value to certain kind of things, then it becomes problematic. And obviously, naturally, I have to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion here. And when we talk about inclusion measures, right, within an organization, there is no such thing as gender lens. I'm not sure if anyone here works in a similar industry as I am, but I have not heard of a conversation surrounding culture of inclusion that has a gender lens. So for example, you would talk about, oh, how do we create a sense of belonging in the context of the workplace, eliminating things like bullying, toxic leadership, harassment, all of these different things. And there is still no conversation about the difference in terms of gender because we're so scared of offending one gender or the other, right? And naturally also in corporate Malaysia, we're not talking about men and women. A lot of organizations recognize the full spectrum of gender identities, that could exist within their organization, but they also couldn't kind of like create specific policies to include these marginalized individuals within their organization because, oh, it's illegal, right? These identities are illegal. So even as a company, if I want to give certain rights to, let's say, gay employees that I have, I can't because that's illegal, right? So I think so to recap my point here, I'm sorry because I'm fasting, I'm not an excuse, but my words are all jumbled up. The point I'm trying to make is, so when it comes to the way government paves the way government attaches value to things, that goes into the corporate sector as well. That's number one. Number two is the way these initiatives that sound so good because we read reports by consultants, by World Bank, and these are great reports with great recommendations, but very little ability for corporations to sort of like decide how do I implement this in the most meaningful way possible. And thirdly is, I think, the idea of inclusion at work, and there is no such conversation about like gender or marginalized identities and intersectionality. So these are for me the three biggest gaps that I could see within corporate Malaysia.
Shakira, you want to say something?
I just want to add to this point. I think, yeah, in terms of policies that are meaningful, I think one thing that I would like to mention is there's in some settings there's been a quota being placed at work. So we have, okay, our corporation will ensure that X% of our board members consist of women, for example. X% of our managerial force would be, will be represented of certain gender or certain ethnicity. And I think while that is fair to some extent, I think when we think about it, we have to be a little bit more careful as well. Because when you just push for numbers, then policy making just become about chasing those numbers. So the similar way that when we talk about female labor force participation, so the government pushes for 60% of women. And at the end of the day, if we meet those targets by just bringing in women who are, who have less care responsibilities, who are more privileged, then I think it's somewhat meaningless to some extent. So I think I just want to mention on quota because I think that's one of the quick wins or the quick measures that companies or organizations want to take. But I think that's a careful, there is a lot of care that needs to be taken when you implement those policies.
And I love that you raised that because a lot of people also forget that when it comes to returning women to the labor workforce, a lot of these women do actually return to workforce, but not to a company. A lot of them actually pivot into entrepreneurship. In fact, a lot of female entrepreneurs that I do know, including myself, actually chanced upon entrepreneurship because they wanted the flexibility that entrepreneurship gave them, but still wanted to be able to participate economically. So probably, Dr. J, from that perspective, would you want to add on that?
I think the key thing is whether we go on in terms of data or what is representation, but at the end of the day, every business is created because that individual wants to create impact, woman or man. And if you want to make a difference, then number one, we need to really, it goes down to those business numbers, right? Whether it's the unit economics, but even the care economy, it's a massively valuable industry. And the reason it's undervalued, number one, because the government looks at it that way, but number two is because private equity and venture capitalists is all men who don't see this as a viable market. So for us to redefine industries, number one is we need more men and women across all these industries, but definitely women need to jump into finance and venture capitalists and sitting in more decision-making positions because And it's not because it's to meet a quota, but it's simply because when I pitch for business, you know, in terms of an industry, 90% of the time it's room filled with men. Yeah, and that means that only some industries get financed. And that is the great problem we have in terms of building a more gender inclusive world, a more disabled inclusive world. We just need more people in the room. But once you have a seat on the table, it is for us to own that space, you know, really, truly building a business is about risk-taking, it's about ability to know your data, but also at the end of the day to create meaning and impact. For us in agri-tech, for example, we have more men applying, more men go to and study agriculture. In Malaysia especially, they study plantation and it attracts men. But I am happy to say that when you are blind in terms, you just look at skill sets and that, we have built now agronomists who are just data-driven. So it's very, you don't need to be, if you want to reimagine an industry, you do need structured, you do need to be very intentional about the kind of business. So that's us at a personal level, but at a broader level, we definitely need more women sitting in the right places and making those right decisions would be my main contention.
Absolutely, and I think having women in these spaces where they are making those decisions as well could help to address some of those issues you raised just now, Amelia. Like, for example, we love the idea of flexible work, you know, but having a woman in that space who's thinking from your perspective can help when that policy is actually made and implemented, because the woman is thinking this needs to apply to both men and women. Yeah. Whereas if a man is making that policy, they may not be seeing it from that same perspective. Now, I'm going to open up the floor to questions in a short while. But before I do, I need to touch on a very, very important question that I have to address before we open up to the floor. And we cannot talk about women participation, women's empowerment, women's rights, and all of this without talking about gender-based violence. Now, while we collect questions from the floor, we're going to take questions via Slido as well. This would be the QR code. So if you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, based on what we've already discussed, do scan the QR code, send us your questions so that we can ask in a short while. Now, while we wait for those questions to come in, gender-based violence. Amelia, Dr. Lai, having both of you on the Anti-Sexual Harassment Tribunal, I'm sure you've seen and heard plenty of instances of GBV, including tech-facilitated GBV in Malaysia and beyond. How does violence against women hold countries like Malaysia back from reaching their full socio-economic potential, especially considering the data that Karima shared earlier in her speech? Every 10 minutes, this is happening. Could you please share with us before we open up our questions to the floor?
Gender-based violence is a very big issue in Malaysia. And I think when you look at it from a social perspective, at the workforce and all of that, there are different sort of like issues. If we look at, you know, a bit more on the social aspect, we have to talk about child marriage, for example, like taking very young girls out of school and then allowing them to get married. And I use the word allowing loosely here. Granting I guess, approval for them to get married, right? And then in the context of the workplace, you have issues like harassment and all of that. What happens when a workplace is not safe for women? They leave. And then you will have worse rates of, you know, female labor force participation, for example. And when it comes to gender-based violence, it's not just harassment. It's the day-to-day sexism, the casual microaggression, the jokes that's not funny, you know, all of these things actually create a very hostile environment for women to work at, which is why there is a question as to why women gravitate towards other kind of sectors. Why don't women work in finance, in manufacturing, in tech, and all of that? And there's already so many things that has been said about that, including when it comes to access to opportunities and things like that. But one of it is actually culture. When you go into a firm, let's say like a finance consulting firm, for example, and just the way people talk, or like the kind of jokes they make with each other, the kind of activities they do after work as team building, right? All of these things would determine whether or not a woman would feel whether or not they are included, whether or not they are part of the organization or otherwise. So harassment is already like such a bad issue to begin with, but really it's more on the day-to-day. What are you doing to create a more wholesome, welcoming culture and environment for all? And we also look at, if we are going to dive deeper into even things like style of conversation and all of that, a lot of leaders, for example, are not sensitized in the way that they speak. When they speak to a team member that is a single mother, for example, like we've investigated cases of toxic leadership when it comes to the way the leader would speak and the kind of joke they would make. So all of these contribute to that to that environment. So what is necessary here is to really, I think, beyond looking at the data, then once you have the data, is to decide what kind of initiative that would be truly meaningful to make people feel welcome and to make people feel included. And this is not just about women. This is also about men. This is also about people who don't sort of like adhere to like traditional gender roles, traditional gender expression. For example, we're talking about women who are more masculine and men who are more feminine, for example. All of these people are excluded. And all of these things create a culture where it's okay to do all of that. And the last point I want to make here is, in my experience over the last 8 years in the industry, is one of the root causes that create this environment in the workplace is actually unconscious bias. So we always say that, there's 15 unconscious bias that you should most definitely know in the context of the workplace, right? From things like name bias to pretty privilege, all the way to things like affect heuristic, the halo and horn effect. All of these things are very, very, very crucial. So I'll give you an example of one bias that we have investigated. There has been an investigation because there was a person, and this person was past the promotion, right? And there was a question as to why did this person not get that promotion? And when we look at that, it's simply because although at the context of the workplace, organizations and companies absolutely believe that they have objective merits and criteria to determine opportunities, promotion, increment of salary, and things like that. But the people who are, making these decisions are still people who have biases and, privilege and prejudice and all of that. So although you have a certain policy that say, no discrimination, zero tolerance on sexual harassment, all of these things, this also goes back to what Amanda said and Dr. Lai also said, right, when it comes to the way it's being implemented in the day-to-day. So because of this bias, right, this person is basically rated based on the perception of the work, right? There's actually a specific bias on this. It's called the idiosyncratic rater effect. So if you're a boss in the context of the workplace and you're supposed to rate the performance of your team members, and this bias basically said that you might be rating your perception of this person's work as opposed to this person's work in itself. So for example, Dr. J and I could work in the same organization, we could have equal contribution, but there is a perception in terms of, do I contribute more or does she contribute more? And when all of this is also like casual microaggression, sexism and things like that. So for me, it affects every single aspect, not just your salary, your promotion and your opportunities, but also the day-to-day, the way you're treated, the way people talk to you and things like that.
Dr. Lai, you want to add to that in the sense that, what Amelia was already saying just now?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what I hope is that gender norms would change, because whether it comes, whether it's related to gender-based violence, when there's no respect for women, right? Yeah, and when there's belittling of women. Also, I've actually done a study on, among male and female lawyers, and one of the findings that I have is that people are very biased against women. When women succeed, even among lawyers, shared by female lawyers, they succeed But on the other hand, their colleagues will say, you managed to make it up there because you slept your way to the top, right? Things like that still persist, yeah, imagine. And another female lawyer would say, I have to work 3 times harder in order to be noticed. So I think it's very important whether it's care work, you know, why care work is only seen as the domain of women. Why not men? I think at the end of the day, gender norms need to change. Just because the work is done by women does not mean that, you know, it's less value. It has, you know, yeah, because that's what is happening, right? Care work, women doing. Teaching, women doing, so it's less value. But imagine if you have teachers who are not capable. What happened to the future generation? Don't you think it's actually a very important occupation that should be well paid? Right? It's the future of the nation. Yeah, when we come to think about it, right? So I think we really need to address the gender norms as to what is being valued, right? We shouldn't discriminate against the work that women does. If it's done by them, so therefore it's paid lower.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, I'm told that there are some audience members who would like to, add their opinion or give some context to this issue. If you'd like to, please do make your way to the mic. If not, we can also take a look at some of the questions that have come in over Slido. Let's have a look. Wow, quite a lot of questions. Okay, let's touch on the first one here. What would the possible reason be that we delay protections and rights for domestic workers and care economy workers? All right, who wants to take that question? What would the possible reason be that we delay protections and rights for domestic workers and care economy workers?
I can start
yes,
with
Amelia,
one point.
Please do.
I think it's taking people for granted. We're used to our parents doing it for free, right? We're used to our mothers doing it for free. And now suddenly when women are saying like, look, there has to be like a ringgit value attached to a care economy, for example, including domestic workers, then the question is, but you've been doing it for free all this while. Why suddenly you are asking for money? So I think it starts from that mindset first. And perhaps I will let Dr. Lai add on.
I think we can look at it from different dimensions. One is actually also, I think I mentioned, the devaluation of work that's being done by women. If it's being done by women, therefore it's given less value. So, which is why also there's actually delay in protection for domestic worker and care economy. And also because in terms of power relation, they actually have less power as well, right? If you look at the bosses, you know, who are the bosses? It's mainly men, right? And when we talk about domestic workers, a lot of them are actually migrant domestic worker. And of course, you know, if they're migrant domestic worker, then therefore they also have less power, which is why, you know, there's less protection for them. So I think that also comes into the picture.
Yeah, I'd also like to connect that question to this question down here. How do you think culture and cultural norms in Malaysia, or even globally, impact development of gender policies and laws, and how this can be addressed in Malaysia? And I want to kind of tie that into a question I wanted to ask about old age poverty as well. Because as we know, women face financial risk already, but women who are older face significantly more financial risk than men do. So perhaps connecting that to culture and cultural norms, why do women have less protections, you know, financially, less protections in general? Is it because of culture and cultural norms?
I think it has to do with that, because if you look at in terms of the economic participation, right, women participate less, and we look at in terms of the EPF, the social security net, you get it only when you work, right? And also because of that, you know, women are also socialized to stay at home. So after they get married, if there's a conversation, hey, honey, I think maybe, you know, in terms of the family, maybe you should consider staying at home to care for the children, things like that. Women would also, you know, accede to that. So we do see that happening. And also when there's divorce happening, right? When there's divorce happening, do we see that alimony, you know, is it easy to enforce the payment of alimony? We know that it's actually an issue in Malaysia, right? And so what happened to the single mothers if they're not receiving the alimony? And as they grow older, you know, it also becomes worse, yeah, when they're older. So, yeah. So I think in terms of the cultural norms, it's actually very important for us to address that and to change that, yeah, so that when it comes to care work, when it comes to working, we don't see men only as the breadwinner. We know that in many families, it's actually two parents working, right? Women are also breadwinners. You know, they are not just in charge of the domestic sphere. So,
yes, please.
Sure. Just in terms of not so much of care, but from an economic standpoint, in terms of aged care, in terms of gender disability solutions, for example, if we really just have more women investing in these industries, it will just transform, because the total addressable market in these industries are actually massive. They're multi-billion-dollar industries in certain countries like Australia. And it is starting in Malaysia. There are pockets of women-owned businesses starting in aged care, for example. And when you put unit economics to an industry like this, it really creates value. People do get better paid in those industries. And it's very transformative as an there is, of course, it may not change the cultural norms, but it's a function. Once you have an economic value, the output would be a cultural, hopefully, movement towards better value. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, Amelia.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this debate whether or not the culture should change the law or whether the law should change the culture. Because this is a huge thing when you're lobbying for policies, right? And there's always this conversation, especially amongst advocates, that the law and the policy should pave the way to create structural and systemic changes first, even if there might be suspicion that that's not how people live their life on the ground. The problem is that I guess this would be a problem in any democratic countries. Because governments are elected, and therefore they tend to make a decision based on what is popular. And if, let's say, they're going to enact something that is against what is accepted, an accepted culture, an accepted norm within that country, then they're no longer going to be popular, right? They're not going to win the next election. So as a result, there's very little incentive for governments to actually create laws that would challenge these norms and this culture to begin with. And the second point I want to make with regards to this is there's also this conversation about, once politicians become politicians, when they're elected, they become MPs, and then what primary function should they serve? Because I have an opinion that they should focus more on creating structural and systemic changes. But you would see a lot of, elected officials, right? What they do is, they focus more on helping on the ground, the grassroots. So they do the kind of work that NGO does because they want that face time with, the community, right? The people who would eventually vote for them. So as a result, again, it becomes an entrenchment of what the people want and keep giving them what they want, and you don't question whether or not what they want is a good thing or a bad thing, and it becomes on and on. It continues on like that.
Okay, I believe we have a question from the floor.
Hello. Yeah, so I wanted to ask, my name is Nadira from Collective Feminist Malaysia, and I would like to ask this question to the panel. Thank you, amazing panels, great women on the floor today. So now that we have all the embassies present today, how can international community, especially country that pledge for a feminist foreign policy, support gender equality in Malaysia by amplifying local decolonial effort and ensuring support that are truly transformative rather than performative? Thank you.
Wow. Okay, who's brave enough to take this question? Dr. Lai?
I can
Amelia?
start,
All right.
All right. When we talk about, and this is not like, for me, this is not a sensitive topic. We hear these conversations happening, and people involved are aware that decolonization it has to be a part of the conversation, right? So I guess the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in these huge efforts where we look at trying to create gender equality, improve women's labor force participation, increasing the participation of persons with disability and all of that. And for me, central to all of this is still locally the kind of biases, prejudices, discrimination, cultures, and norms that are so toxic and so harmful that we have to sort of like talk about, right? And when we talk about at policy level and making the law, while decolonization is a very important aspect to it, for me, it's a conversation that's probably suitable for a forum like this, right? Where we talk about, okay, how do you make sure that with foreign aid, for example, that our initiatives are still, I guess, stay true to who we are and our backgrounds and all of that. And speaking from my experience, I think we all have a part to play as Malaysians when we do like projects in collaboration. For example, we receive funding, for example, we kind of have to play that role and ask, okay, how do I localize this, and not take things like take it and just, you know, replicate, for example, which I think something that is being done quite a fair bit. And in my experience working with international organizations here in Malaysia as well, that is a conversation that is constantly being had. So, you know, there will be a conversation, how do we localize this as sensitively as possible and things like that. One thing I think a slightly more empathetic, I guess, lens to this is people who are running these initiatives are also learning. And sometimes there are things that we don't know because it's a mistake we've never made before. And therefore, you know, we have to kind of like let these conversations happen. And on the other hand, if you are at the receiving end of receiving certain criticism because your initiatives, your program, and your policy indeed entrenches neo-colonization, for example, then on that end, you just have to be willing and open to receive that criticism, and then we improve and we move on. None of us here have run like a perfect policy, a perfect initiative. And I think being forgiving while at the same time holding each other accountable to make sure that we do it as best as possible to the people on the ground, to the beneficiaries, I think that is important. So when you do policies here, that's a question that you must definitely ask. How do you decolonize and move forward from there?
Yeah, I think I just want to add on to that dialogue. I think dialogue between both parties are important because, yes, we want to localize it, we want to indigenize it, that's for sure. But on the other hand, I'm sure you all have heard of cultural relativism, you know. In some parts of the world, you know, gender-based violence is accepted. So then how do we challenge that as well? So I think it's very important for dialogue to happen, for both sides to listen to each other and see also sometimes when it comes to certain issues, when it comes to harmful practices, how we could actually challenge it, you know, by having international solidarity. So I think dialogue and also listening to each other and finding a way also to challenge local practices that are harmful as well at the same time.
I've been told I have time for one last question, so let's take that last question from our guest here. Yes. Please do. Yes.
Thank you very much for comprehensive and this is great discussion. My name is Mako and I'm a professor of Hosei University, Japan. And as an academia, and of course, and you know, I agree with Satyan, and you know, it's very important to discuss and define and all the discussion. And another thing, who can make the policy for gender issues? Of course, we are talking about the gender mainstreaming, and also the Satyan, and you also help the government as well. So how can we consider about citizens' power to make the policy, especially for gender equality? How can you, how can you evaluate the capability and the possibility of civil society's power? So like a civil society organization, you can see, and maybe all of you know, and there are a lot of gender-related organization, NCWO, and also the grassroots organization. So how do you evaluate the capability and the collaboration or something? Maybe Satya?
Yeah. Hi, Marco. Great to see
question.
you.
All right.
Yeah, great to see you. She's actually also lecturer in UM, yeah? So, yeah, good to see you. I think if you look at gender-based violence, in terms of the laws that has been passed, right, criminalizing of stalking, in terms of the Domestic Violence Act, in terms of the Anti-Sexual Harassment Act, civil society or women's NGO have actually been, you know, have played a big part in it. So in that sense, I think their advocacy efforts have paid off. But of course, we are also very thankful that we have a government who's also sensitive to that, who actually take those up as well. Because, you know, we can advocate, women's organization can advocate all they like, but on the other hand, if government is not responsive, it does not, it does not move anywhere as well. So yeah, so civil society, women's NGO have been very important and significant in that aspect. And I believe they will continue to be. For example, I think the other day I just read in the newspaper, and this was by a women's aid organization. They were talking about femicide, right? In Malaysia, there's no notion of femicide. So because of that, femicide is basically where a woman or girls are being killed because of their gender. It's actually the extreme, the most extreme form of violence. Because there's actually no such notion, you don't have stats that could capture that. So now, how do women's aid organizations get those stats? They monitor the media to see the cases that's being reported in the media. But we know when it's cases that's being reported in the media, we don't have the national prevalence, right? So because of that, we don't know how terrible or how bad, it is. Yeah, so
we come back to data.
That's right.
Right. So unfortunately, we seem to have run out of time. 1.5 hours just flew right past. And we were initially thinking, how are we going to talk enough for 1.5 hours? I know we have so many more questions that you have sent to us on Slido. Ladies, can I check, will you be around with us for the next half hour or so that if any one of you asked those questions would like to approach you individually, would that be okay? Yeah. Yes? Yeah. All right, fantastic. Now, to just quickly wrap up our conversation so we can continue with the rest of our program, I think most importantly, since we're here talking about action today, we've talked about so many things. We know where the gaps lie. We know it starts with data. We know that it starts with having women in spaces that can help to inform the decisions that need to be made. Then only we go into policies, then only we go into budgeting, and then from henceforth. So we know what needs to be done. But if you could just in one single sentence state, what is the most important step Malaysia needs to take right now to accelerate gender equality and inclusion? What would that be? I'd like to start with you, Amanda.
I would like to say that you must focus more on empathy and not to say, we said gender equality, but I would like to call people to actually focus on equity instead of equality. Because when we talk about equality, it's basically equal rights, equal opportunity. But when we talk about equity, it's basically what is fair. What do you need to do to make sure one person's needs are accommodated, to make sure he or she is fully supported, regardless whether he's a woman or man, instead of what is equal. What is fair is more practical. So I would say focus on equity and practice empathy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Amanda. I think we don't talk about equity enough, do we? All right, Dr. Lai.
I think for me, it is to change the gender norms. Right, to change the gender norms and not stereotype women and men in terms of their capability and ability. And if we manage to do that, I think we can move forward in all the various arenas that we have mentioned and highlighted.
Yeah, because I think we've established that culture and cultural norms are quite a big problem for us here, especially in Asia, yeah? All right, Amelia.
For me, I think it would really to measure the impact of our programs. We have so many different kind of initiatives, laws, policies, and at the end of it, I would like to see a report on what is the outcome, how has the money been spent, who's like impacted by it, and really when again we're looking at the data of this report, I think as granular as possible, as gender segregated as possible, and I think from there we can take efforts to improve, because we have to work on the mindset that no policy, no initiative will be perfect in the first place, right? Yeah. So a bit more reporting on the impact of things, I think I would very much appreciate that.
Yeah, so we're basically monitoring the progress and success of those.
And not NGO doing it for the government, like the government doing it themselves and then reporting it.
Yes. All right. Dr. J, we didn't get to ask you as many questions related to STEM and entrepreneurship as we would have liked to, but what is your single most important step?
Right. More seats at the table, but more empowered seats, women with decision-making abilities and capabilities who are then avail the resources, supports and networks to make the right decisions and create transformative solutions for multiple industries.
And not just to fill a quota, but meaningful representation.
Empowered seats, yes.
Fantastic. And of course, Shakira, wrap things up for us.
Okay, so I have two actually. One, I think a bigger focus on intersectionality when it comes to policy making and decision making. And I think my final say is that to see women beyond just our economic values and see us as individuals regardless.
Very true. It's important that we look at it from an economic lens as well, but yes, we are so much more than what we bring to the table financially. We have value in so many other areas as well. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to give a big round of applause to our panel. Thank you so much for all of your input and insights. It's been remarkable 1.5 hours with you. And with that, I would like to invite on stage Ms. Karima Al-Khoury and Dr. Julita Onabanjo to please present a token of appreciation to each of our panelists and grab a photo with us as well. So if we could have our panelists step forward, please, and have Ms. Karima and Dr. Julita in the center. All right. All right. First up, we'd like to present tokens to Shakira, Dr. J, Amanda, Dr. Lai, and of course, Amelia. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause once more to our panelists. How about let's have a nice group photo with everybody. I've been told to join the photo. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Karima, Dr. Julita, Amanda, Dr. Lai, Amelia, Dr. J, and of course Shakira. One more big round of applause. Thank you so much, ladies, for your time today and for your insights. And I hope that everything that our panelists have shared will result in actual commitment to action, and that next year when we meet again for IWD, we'll see some real change. Yes? Thank you once again, ladies. Thank you. All right, you may return to your seats. I need to hobble my way back to my station as well.